Hello everyone, so today I'm going to show you how to build a to-do list app inside the Dittofi Design Studio. The app that we're going to build is this little Dittofi to-do app. So just a quick example of how this is going to work. If we type in a list of to-dos, like walk the dog for example, and press the add to-do button here, you're going to see that that's going to add an item to our to-do list. We could add another one, so for example go for a swim and press the add to do button, and that's going to add another to do underneath the first one. So we might not get through the whole of this tutorial. We might not get all the features done in this tutorial, but I'll make subsequent tutorials to explain more about how these applications are built inside the Dittofi Design Studio. So to start with then, this is the Dittofi Design Studio. The way that it's structured is to mimic a full stack application builder. So you have a front end page builder over here, and then the other three tabs down here allow you to build up back end logic in these two. And then this one here allows you to configure your database. What we're going to be doing in this session is, as I mentioned, we're going to be building this Dittofi to do app. That's going to require us to follow this overall structure for an application, and this is how really a lot of the applications that are built on Dittofi look. They have a web-based front end which automatically generates real source code in the React and Redux HTML CSS frameworks. The web app then also we also have the option to generate a full backend which includes server-side logic which can be put into what are called endpoints and actions. And then we also run this off a database in the backend as well. And we have two databases that underpin the system. One which is set up to specifically handle big data sets, and the other one which looks at more relational type data, smaller data sets. The difference between Dittofi and other full stack application builders that are out there on the market is that Dittofi automatically generates real source code for the applications, and we allow the users to export that source code so that they can own the source code for their software as well, which is quite a major advantage, obviously. So to begin with then, what we're going to do is we're going to start off by building out a database which is going to store all of the to-dos for our to-do app. So over here, this is an example of what we finished off with. The walk the dog, go for the swim. So this would be information that would be stored in our database inside our to-do app. So let's set that up now, and to do that you need to come over to our database tab, which is over here. You can press the add table button and you can add a to-do, a table, let's call it to-dos, and if you press the create button down here, you can then create that table. So this is really kind of like the back-end database portion of your application. You can create multiple tables for your database by pressing the new table button. For those who are kind of more technically minded, you can also generate whole database schemas directly out of SQL or out of JSON format as well. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're just going to add, we're going to create just a very simple table. We're going to give a field called name, and that name is going to hold all of our to-do data in it. We're just going to add then quickly here with the plus button just an example to do. So we're going to call this one walk the dog, like that, and press the save button. In fact, let's add two so that we have something to test with. So we'll call the second one buy some bread, and press save. So now you've got both of those items inside your database. So from that first diagram here that we showed, we're trying to build this full stack, and we've just set up here a table which is going to store all of our to-dos data in it. The next thing we need to do is we need to create a way to interact for our front end and even our back end to interact with that database that we've just set up. So we want to, let's say the first thing we want to do is we want to get all the information, get that list of to-dos that we've got within our database and just display it on the screen. So to do that, the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to build an endpoint. Now, for those of you who don't know, an endpoint is a bit like an ear that's kind of sitting there listening for someone to ask it a request, to make a request of it. So the front end of our web app eventually is going to say, okay, please, can you send me all of the data, all of my to-dos data out of the database? So that get request, like get me that information, is going to go to this endpoint. The endpoint is then going to say, okay, I'm going to go and start an action to go and get that data. So that's this actions bit here. And then that action is going to go and actually get that data, collect it up, and it's going to pass that to-dos list back to the endpoint, which is then going to push it back towards the web app. So that's kind of the structure that we're going for here. We're asking our endpoint to go and start an action to go and get data, and then the action is passing that data back to our endpoint and then back to our web app. So this means that the first thing we need to do is we need to define an endpoint, which is going to be sitting there listening for that request. So to do that, we come over to our Endpoints tab down here and we press the Add Endpoints button. In here, what we're going to do is, this is a new endpoint that we're creating. So we're going to do, call this get all to-dos data, like that. And what we're going to do is going to give that a path, which is the place, all to-dos data, or all to-dos. This is going to be the path that the front end is going to actually be addressing. So this is the way the front end knows in an application where we have multiple endpoints. This is where the front end is going to know to ask information of if it wants to get all the to-dos data. It's going to say, I want to ask the endpoint that has this path to get all the data out of my database. So that's really done now. You press the save button there. That's kind of complete. So we've now just set up, out of this whole process, we've set up a database which has got a few rows of data in for our different to-dos. We've also set up an endpoint which is now sitting there waiting, for someone to ask it to get those to-dos out of the database or to do something. We need to now set up an associated action. So an action that's going to be associated with this endpoint, which is actually going to go and fetch the data, fetch the list of to-dos from the database and send it back to the endpoint. So to do that, we come over to our Actions tab and we press the Add Action button down here. You can also, if you've got actions already, you can also press the New Action button up here. And the first thing we're going to do is give it a name. So we're going to call this like Get All To-Dos up here. We've got a trigger. So we're going to say that this is going to get all to-dos data. This trigger is an endpoint. You can trigger actions from actions. You can trigger actions on a schedule. But in this case, we want to use an endpoint to trigger this action. And that's because the endpoint is sitting waiting for a signal to say, go and get me the data. And that endpoint is then going to start off an associated action. So this is where that association happens. Now at this point, what we've configured the ability for this action to go and ask the database for the data, but we haven't given the action anywhere to store the data that gets returned to it. So in order to do that, we need to create what's called a variable by pressing the Add button down here. And we need to set a particular kind for that variable. So the kind we need to set is called a collection, and this is like a list. So this is telling our action that we're able to store information that's being sent back to it from our database in a collection as a kind of a list. So this will be the list of all the to-dos that get sent back. So we can give a label to this. So we're going to call it all to-dos like this. We're going to give a name to it, which we're going to do the same thing there as well. The type is set to basic in this case. If you wanted to do for the more technical people, if you wanted to run custom queries, this is where you would do it in here. But for now, we're just going to stick this to basic. We select a model and we pick the to-dos model. So this tells us the shape of the data that's going to get passed back to us from our database. It tells us we're going to get a list, and that list is going to contain data that is in this shape here. It's going to have an ID, a created at, and a name. It's our to-dos data model over here. So that's what we've set up here. And now we're just going to click all to-dos from this drop down. This is our response variable. So this information here, this variable that we've set up, we're going to pass that variable back as a response to our endpoint. So what we can do now, now what we've done is if we press save down here, just so that we've saved that all. Now what we've done is we've created this full backend workflow in order to start an endpoint that's going to, to talk to an endpoint, which is then going to go and start an action, which is going to go and fetch our to-dos list, send that to-dos list back to our action, which is going to take that to-dos list, put it into a response variable, which is then going to get passed to our endpoint over here. And then in our next step, we're going to pass that back to our web app. Before we do that, let's just test out the process so far so we can understand more about what we've done. And to do that, we need to come up here and we need to generate our code. So generate code for endpoint action and data model, and press the generate code. So what this is doing underneath the hood is it's automatically generating full stack source code, which it is providing back to full stack source code. It's writing the actual lines of computer code that is needed to run this entire process. And like I said at the start, the distinction with Dittofi and other application builders out there is that source code that we automatically generate, that's professional grade code. It looks exactly the same as if it was written by a human being. The only difference is that we do it using a visual builder. But the code that we actually generate there is high quality professional grade code that would be produced by like an enterprise software company. So now let's test this endpoint that we've created. So to do that, we press the run button up here. And what you'll see down here once we run that is you get a code here, which is a code 200 response. So that's a successful response. If you have another code like a 500 or a 404 or 403, you've made a mistake in the configuration, and there'll be some reasons for why you might have done that, which you can then go and investigate. But in our case, we have a success 200 message come back, and that's returned this information here. So you can see you've got here a name field which is called walk the dog, and you've got another one here which is called buy some bread. This is the data that's been sent out of our data store. So you've got the ID created at and the name fields, and you've got two records, record number 1 and record number 2. And if we come to our table, it corresponds here. So you've got the ID created at and name, and you've got the walk the dog and the buy some bread to-dos in here. So what we did then when we pressed the run button is we manually triggered that endpoint to start and go and start the action, get the data, return the to-dos list to the endpoint. What we want to do next is we want to, rather than doing that by clicking the run button in our back end, is we want our user to be able to start that process from the front end web app. So in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to head on over to our front end builder. And the first thing we need to do is we need to create a variable for our front end. So this is going to store that list of information that we generated in our back end inside this collection variable for our front end. So I'm going to press the save button here, and that's going to create that variable. So this variable here is going to be used to store this list of information here. That's why we picked the type here collection, because it's going to match the list form that we created for our action and our endpoint. So now we need a way to actually start the endpoint from the front end of our system. And to do that, we use what are called workflows. So with a workflow, we create a new workflow by clicking the new button up here. We give a name to this, so we're going to call it get all to-dos. This is going to start off our workflow, and press the save button here. Now we're going to come over to our actions and events graph, and we're going to press the little plus button here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to set up a kind for this workflow. Now this can be kind of run a custom block of code. With the run custom, you can do loops, condition statements. You can create alerts, confirmation, notifications, and so on. And those can all be a type of event within this chain. But in our case, what we want to do is we want our front end to trigger an endpoint. So we pick run endpoint as the kind of event that we want to use here. The endpoint that we're going to hit, we want to start, is called the get all to-dos data. So once we get all the to-dos data, or once we start that endpoint, we're going to then call that action, and then that's going to go and ask the database for data, a list of to-dos. That list of to-dos is going to get passed back to our action, which is going to get passed back to our endpoint, and that list of to-dos is then going to come back to our front end of our application. Once it's in the front end of our application, it's here as a response. So we need a place to take that response. So I'm going to call this all to-dos endpoint response. So this is now where the to-dos data is going to live. And we're also going to get a code back, which in our case was that code 200, that success message, which meant that the action effectively ran. The endpoint effectively ran. So we're going to get that response code here, and we're going to save that information as well. We press save and close that down. We now want to, now that we've run that endpoint, we've got all that data that's come back, that list of to-dos, and all that list of to-dos is stored inside this all to-dos endpoint response. What I can do next is we might want to display that information on the screen for our user so they know, what the list of to-dos might actually be. So to do that, we come up here, we're going to add another kind, and in this kind we're going to call set field, which is going to allow us to set or to map values, those list values back to the front end of our system, back to the variable that we created over here. In fact, this all to-dos collection, which is our front end variable. So this front end variable is going to be available on the page, and on our actual design tab for when we're building our application, and we can then kind of choose where that list is going to be displayed. But we need to actually set that variable. So to actually set it, we need to take the information that we got back at this stage when we ran the endpoint, and we need to push this all to-dos endpoint response, which is that list of all to-dos. We need to push that list of all to-dos into this variable, and to do that we need an event, and that event is the set fields event. So I'm going to grab that set fields event, and then in here what I can do is I can grab a variable, my all to-dos collection, so that's my front end variable, and I'm going to say which information I want to put into it. So that's going to be the all to-dos endpoint response up here. Press the OK button, press the save button here, and close that down. So now we've set all this up. What we've done is we've set up a database which is storing a list of to-dos, and we've worked out a way that we can ask the database for for that list by triggering an endpoint. That endpoint is going to be triggered by the front end of our application, and once we've triggered it, and we've got the data, it's going to send all that list of to-dos back to our front end again. So once we have that information in the front end, we want to represent it in some way on the page for our users to actually see. So in order to do that, what we can do is we can grab components from the left-hand side of the screen, and we can drop them on the page so that we have kind of like a nice way of looking at the information that comes back. So to do this now, I'm going to do this very, very simply, and I'll do another video after this, which will show you kind of how to make this look a little bit more pretty. But for now, let's just represent this data on this first page. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to take an element from the left-hand side. In this case, I've added a div block. And you can press this little red button here, and this will open up a little settings panel. That settings panel is underneath this cog here. So this is the design tab, and this is kind of what we call the properties tab. So we can go into the properties tab. So you've got the design one and the properties one. And underneath the properties tab, you've got this option for repeating with. So this allows us to create what we call a repeating group, and the repeating group will then list, the repeating group will allow you to associate a particular element on the page with a variable. So in our case, we've got an all to-dos variable, which we want to decide where we're going to put the to-dos list. So here, what we can do is we can click into this repeating group, and we can bind our div block, our page element, so this div block here, with that all to dos, and that's going to create the option for a list of information to be represented on the page. So the problem with the way we've set this up now is that if we look at our data structure, we've got an ID, a created at, and a name field in our database. But actually, we don't really care about the ID and the created at, or at least our user is not going to care about the ID and the created at field. They just want to know what the list of different to-dos are in their to-do list. So in order to work that out, like how that's set up, what you can do is you need to tell the variable, which is storing lists of information, which field you want to represent on the page. So do you want to represent the ID, created at, and name, or do you want to just do the name? So in our case, we just want to do the name. So to do that, if we add a heading into this first box here, what you can do, if you come over to the properties tab, so remember you've got the styles tab here and you've got the properties tab here, you can pick up this text here, and you can just write a tiny little formula, which is going to say that for the row of data that comes back in our list, we just want to show there the name, and then you close the brackets off there. So you see we use the curly braces, and then it will tell us if we've got the formula correct at the bottom. I'm going to press the OK button down here, and now we've basically set that entire flow up all the way from the start to the end. The only remaining thing is we need a way to trigger the whole process to start. So triggering the whole process to start, that will involve either kicking off the particular workflow to start, and in order to do that, you could have, for example, like a button that you put on the page, and then you could have your user click that button, or alternatively, you could have like a page load, which is what we're going to do here. So to do that, if you come over to this little lightning bolt here, this is going to allow you to start that process. It gives you like a trigger to start a workflow. So if I press the add workflow button, it's going to put a trigger in underneath. I can pick a trigger, which is going to be, in this case, let's call it onload. And I'm going to pick a workflow to trigger onload, which is going to be the get all to-dos workflow. That get all to-dos workflow, you'll remember, we created at this workflows page here. So once the page then loads up, that's going to start this get all to-dos, and then it's going to come get all to-dos workflow, which is then going to run our endpoint, which is then going to go and start this endpoint, which is then going to go to our start an action, which is going to go and pick up data out of our database. So that's then going to return all that information, pushing it through the various variables until it ends up on the page here. So if I do file save on this, so you can do the file and save button just to make sure you've saved all the configuration down. You then come up and you can regenerate that computer code again. So you don't have to add a comment here, but we're just going to call this test to-dos front end, something like that, and press the generate code. So now this is writing out, again, human readable code, full stack source code, professional grade, looks exactly like it looks if a human were to write it, and it's going to write that computer code now. So now what we're going to do is just going to test this quickly. So in our data model, we've got walk the dog and buy some bread. So what we would expect if we press the preview button here is that when we preview this app, we get that walk the dog and buy some bread. So that means the whole process worked. The page loaded up, and when it loaded up, it ran that entire workflow all the way through from your back end code all the way back through to your front end code. So I think probably what I'll do now is I'll stop and I'll make a follow-on recording showing you how you can make the next event in your in the chain. So what we wanted to do after this is we wanted to create, I guess, a button that we wanted to probably drop into the top part of this application here. So we probably wanted like a text input field that we would put in here, and then we probably wanted something like this at the end, and we wanted to be able to add items. Sorry, I'm just going to center align that quickly. We wanted to be able to start adding to-dos to our list, so like add to-dos to to-dos list. We wanted to be able to click a button and be able to add new ones. In order to do that, we'll need to go through that process again, exactly the same process, but in this case, we'll need to set up a create a new to do. So we're actually gonna have to push a record into our database. So it's just a different action and event that we need to set up, but we can use the same overall structure to do that. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here, and we can just kind of go back to that as, I guess, the next tutorial. So I hope that was helpful. Please let me know how helpful it was in the comments below. Yeah, looking forward to seeing you for the next one. And just make sure that you watch it back through. You see exactly where the variables get set, because you can build out really powerful, really complex full stack apps using this platform. You just kind of need to practice a little bit with it to make sure that you fully understand how it all works. And then, yeah, we've built, event management platforms, cryptocurrency based platforms, whole CRM systems. We've built a whole bunch of stuff. We've had a whole bunch of clients that have built a whole bunch of stuff using the technology. So you can do it as well. You just have to kind of learn how the platforms piece together. Anyway, enough of me rambling on. I hope that was helpful, and looking forward to seeing you for the next one, where we're going to hook up our to-dos list button up here. Thank you.